So I decided in the hottest day of the year that I wanted to do this video because the last couple of weeks were fairly cold. So now that it's hot, why not stand in front of a fucking... I forgot to turn the light on. Happy Pride and happy Bite, my fellow gay vampires. Why the fuck are vampires so gay? This is a question that was more or less always kind of here in my head. So I thought, why not actually find out why those damn vampires are literally the most like gay thing ever, or at least always just a little bit queer. So, vampires. There's a huge variety of characteristics that you can attribute to vampires. Probably the most obvious ones are that they like to drink blood, and that they're in most cases immortal. Maybe that they can't go out and feel sunshine because they're gonna burn to death, or they're gonna lose their powers, or sometimes glitter a bit, like my favorite vampire. Maybe they can turn themselves into a bat, whatever you like. But what always stood out, for me at least, was this slight certain sexual attraction. And I'm sure that's mostly because of the way I look, but I think there's a reason why vampires are most of the times associated with romanticism and sexuality, even if they are obviously in the horror genre and are obviously monsters and creatures. By the way, hottest day of the year, I decided to make this fucking video. So if I just showered, and if there's sweat on me, I cried because my own words move myself so much. But they're not only sexual, but also queer icons. One can say that vampires have a lot of typical queer attributes, even if those are displayed in a more heteronormative way. And there's a reason for that, a reason that involves the entire history of vampirism. So we have to kind of find out why vampires were created in the first place. The vampire, or vampire, or vampire, or whatever. So it all started with some gay ass fucking poet with a drag name called Lord Byron.
Who's the president, man? Who's the president? Byron. Who's the president? Byron. We live back at Coney Island with this dickhead.
I know it's the funny name, it's the funny joke. Anyway, Lord Byron hired a young doctor called Polidori to be his personal doctor. Polidori? Yeah, I know I usually skip this part in porn. So this Lord Byron was not only a poet and an author, but also the occasional little male lover. And this lifestyle in the start of the 19th century gave him, at the ripe age of about 25, probably more STDs than are currently in existence. But he still had this sexual attraction for many people for some reason that also fascinated our little Polidori. So after his little lifestyle got him into a lot of money problem, he went out to the UK and decided to travel Europe. Different times I wish I got into money problems and sadly had to travel Europe. And so he came to a fateful night in the year 1816, where he, together with Polidori, and I have to read this now, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Godwin, and Claire Clermont sat down in a villa called Villa Diodati or some shit. And so they started to tell each other horror tales. And which story was created on that fateful night? Exactly, Frankenstein's monster. But also a fragment by Byron was first told, which was sadly never really finished to my knowledge. So 3 years later, Polidori, who wasn't Lord Byron's personal doctor anymore, recalled Byron's story and their night together. And inspired by the vampires in a fragment, he wrote a novel, The Vampire. It's about this young guy who started working for a royalty called Lord Ruthven. And this young protagonist was fucking gobsmacked, fucking flabbergasted at the sight of Ruthven. But knowing just this, one could argue that this isn't really queer. Just a young guy thinking that royalty is cool. That's like 90% of Britain for some reason. But, and there's always a but, there's this little thing. Lord Ruthven was a pet name for Lord Byron, which was given to him by one of his ex-girlfriends. So Lord Ruthven is Lord Byron, and Lord Byron is someone who fucked around with a lot of men. So through this name, the character got heavily coded as bisexual. So yeah, Lord Ruthven was pretty much the first modern vampire and is most likely a template for like all the other vampires that came after him. Even Robert Pattinson, Carmilla, Carmilla. 50 years later, the next big vampire novel came out that had a lot of influence on future stories of vampirism. In the year 1871, the Irish, I know, Irish, cringe, imagine being Irish at top of the morning. An Irish author called Sheridan Le Fanu wrote his novel Carmilla. Why he wrote it, I don't know. But it's about a fucking lesbian, so, or at least in my silly little head. Well, you could, you know, make up your own mind. Carmilla is about a young royalness who lives together with her dad. Because her dad's a fucking prig, she doesn't have that much of outside contact and is generally very alone. But then, little accident with the carriage which forced Carmilla to take care of her girl. The mother of was involved in it and, you know, I think like 3 months or something. And Carmilla is fucking staggered by this little creature of a woman who was suddenly in her house. And one could argue that she developed feelings for her, which could also very well be read as a romantic thing. But Carmilla is a vampire who likes the blood of young women. There's a lot of other stuff happening, and Carmilla is genuinely like a very good story, so please read it, thank you. The Big Daddy. You can't talk about vampires, you can't have a discussion or a video essay about the presentations of vampires without Big Daddy himself, the first thing that comes to mind when talking about vampires. Exactly, you know what I'm talking about. Edward Cullen, played by critically acclaimed actor Robert Pattinson. Dracula. Who isn't just extremely big coded as a bisexual, but also is about the complex own feelings of the author's sexuality and a supposed little friend of his. You might know that friend, because there are 2 really funny facts about Bram Stoker. The werewolf scene in Dracula was hot, and he was besties with Oscar Wilde, who, while being a highly famous author himself, got into a lot of attention because he was very open about his own bisexuality, but of course not good attention. There was a lot of bad press, and he even got a court case slapped across his bisexual face. Sadly, Stoker himself started to strongly condemn Wilde, while also finding his own feelings sexual-wise. There's not a definite answer, and it's very hard to say, and something that historians even now break their head about, but many people think that Stoker maybe could have been gay, because it's very known that he wrote a lot of very heartfelt letters to people such as Walt Whitman, and that I don't think that's a woman's name. But differently than Oscar Wilde, he never really was open about his feelings, and even wrote in some letters that he was repressing something. So all these repressed feelings went into Dracula, woohoo, without a question. Happy Pride Month was presented as a bisexual. He not only has feelings and an interest in Mina, but also in Jonathan. But I mean, who wouldn't? It's fucking Neo, you know? One could even interpret that exactly this bisexuality was the thing that made Dracula so monstrous. Stoker at this point, at least publicly, had a strong dislike for Wilde. Sexuality and vampires. What we have to keep in mind for the entire duration of this video is that the vampire is an inherently sexual being. Cheers to that. That's why vampires were so popular to begin with. It made it possible to write about something that you normally couldn't write about. You couldn't write a sex scene, you couldn't write people fucking. You were able to write about a vampire sucking blood out of someone's neck, which could be even a more intimate thing, guys. A vampire bite is a sexual thing. It's a sexual act in which the vampire penetrates someone's body while bodily fluids get mixed and put into someone. It's not that hard to see a parallel between a vampire bite and fucking... But a vampire penetrates their victims regardless of gender. A vampire bite always looks identical, which is why it was also easier to write about men being intimate there wasn't a difference between a heterosexual and a homosexual bite, because it's just a bite, but it isn't at the same time. Lesbian vampires. But this little gay ass here wasn't the first person that noticed the inherent sexuality of vampires, of course, which resulted in that Hollywood put Dracula's bite into the Hays Code. It was just too sexual. But the USA isn't the only country that exists in this world, even though many people believe that. So in the 60s in Italy, this little motion picture called Blood and Roses came out, who had a canon lesbian vampiress in it. And because this movie did rounds in the box office, a lot of similar movies came out during the sexploitation era. Also describe that, please. I do have to add that lesbian vampire movies in the sexploitation era of Italy wasn't the best representation. It did play mostly on the male gaze, and their behavior was always met with punishment, and most of the time the vampires were fucking murked at the end. Staked. They were staked. And one could argue that the vampires got staked because they were vampires, but if you think about how conjoined the symbolism of vampires and sexuality as a whole are, you could kinda see it as a punishment for that, for the bite, for the sexual act. What's also kind of weird is that the vampires' love interests were always bisexual. They did like the vampires, but ended in a hetero relationship or dead at the end of the movie. Because two vampires obviously couldn't be together at the end. That would be fucking silly. What do you mean? Two women. Ugh. Other queer vampires. Italian lesbian vampiresses weren't the only queer vampire thing that came out in the 70s, of course. We also have Interview with a Vampire, who came out in 1976, which also had someone in the book coming out. Get it? Because it was explicitly queer coming out book coming out, but he came out, which was one of the first stories where the vampire wasn't a monster that had to be killed, but a tragic main character with a complex life. There's also the Hunger, who had more than enough bisexual coding, not only because David Bowie, who was at the time already outed as a bisexual, was one of the main characters. Great movie, by the way. Another movie is The Lost Boys, who had clear queer undertones, not only because the director was an openly homosexual man. The movie isn't explicitly queer, but if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. And I could probably talk about more vampire movies. Daughters of Darkness, 1971. Vampiresses seducing women into becoming their partners. Fucking gay. Friday Night, 1985. If Cherry and Charlie aren't fucking fruits, then I don't know what to tell you. Incredibly gay. Bit, I guess, 2019. Not the best movie ever, but a neon queer adventure with a trans character as the lead role. I guess very queer, yeah. Blood Spattered Bride, 1972. Dracula's Daughter, 1936. Nadia, 1994. Do I need to keep going? Alright. Vampire Lovers, 1970. Straight up lesbian porn. I guess Vampiros Lesbos, 1971. I am not kidding with that title. Lust for a Vampire, 1971. Jennifer's Body, 2009. I like that it was heavily implied that Chris Pratt died in that fire. Hey, you know what? Fucking Twilight, bitch. The most heteronormative movie series ever had clearly bisexual coded vampire characters. It's almost like you can't make a vampire not gay, even though you're trying so hard. There's a lot. And this goes with most vampire movies. Hero or villain, nearly every vampire had at least queer undertones with their presentation and behavior, their acting. And we're at the point where I guess every vampire is bisexual, because most acclaimed fantasy writers just tell their audience that if you're immortal, if you live forever, you're gonna eventually just try it out because you're fucking bored, you know? You don't want always the same for 1,000 years. All vampires are at least a little bit queer. So with all this information, we determined that while the original vampire didn't really have something to do with queerness, we can safely say that the vampire as a character was created to be queer. They were created out of authors' own frustration because of queerness or of queerness in their environment. This is a trope that is clearly just grounded in what a vampire should be. And hey, Hollywood. Ah! Fuck's sake. Okay, you know, kind of Hollywood. You don't need to hurt me, okay? Hey, Hollywood, you kind of made vampires even more gay by putting the vampire's bite under the Hays Code, implying that a vampire's bite can be a sexual act. So if a vampire bites man and woman, which a vampire will do, you automatically made them queer because you put it in the fucking Hays Code. And then Anne Rice came. May she rest in peace. She died last December. What a fucking tragedy that was. With Interview with a Vampire, which without a doubt was the most popular, most influential book ever created, with vampires as protagonists. And all of them were queer, which solidified vampires with queerness even more. Boop boop. Vampires can be protagonists and villains, heroes, monsters, whatever you want. The inherent queerness of vampires is something that will always be in every vampire ever created. The story of the modern vampire is a queer story, and it's unimaginable to have it not be that way. So, vampires are fucking gay. Okay, thank you very much. If you like this video, leave a like, subscribe. And I wish you a very good morning, lunch, afternoon, dinner, everything. Good night. Bye bye. Very glad that this is over. I'm gonna do this a bunch of times, but I hope it's not in the fucking summer heat. I hope I pick out a better fucking time. Why am I still talking?